July 3rd, 1866, 6:47 a.m. The morning mist still clung to the Elbe River valley near the Bohemian village of Königgrätz, when Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of the Prussian 43rd Infantry Regiment watched the first Austrian columns emerge from the fog. Through his field glasses he counted the white-coated infantry formations spreading across the gentle hills like an enormous chessboard of disciplined violence. 15,000 Austrian soldiers, the finest army in Central Europe, commanded by Feldzeugmeister Ludwig von Benedek, a man who had crushed Italian armies and earned the respect of every military professional on the continent. Weber allowed himself a thin smile. His regiment carried 900 of Prussia's greatest advantage, a weapon most of Europe still dismissed as a novelty prone to failure. The Dreyse Needle Gun, officially the Sühnnadelgewehr, looked unremarkable. A simple bolt-action rifle weighing just over 10 pounds with a slim profile and a curious knob protruding from the right side of the receiver. Austrian officers who had examined captured examples in previous skirmishes reported it as interesting but impractical. The long firing pin, the needle that gave the weapon its name, was supposedly fragile and prone to breakage. The breech mechanism leaked gas that burned shooters' faces. The paper cartridges were vulnerable to moisture. Most damning in the eyes of the military conservatives, it was a rifle that encouraged soldiers to waste ammunition. What the Austrians didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined until that morning's bloodbath, was that they were marching into the first truly modern battle in European history. The Dreyse Needle Gun had transformed Prussian infantry into something unprecedented. Soldiers who could fire 5 aimed shots per minute from any position including lying prone, who could load and fire while advancing, who could maintain sustained fire that would turn the carefully orchestrated ballet of 19th century warfare into a slaughter. The story of how Prussia came to arm its entire infantry with a breech-loading rifle while every other major power clung to muzzle-loaders is a tale of bureaucratic courage, technological persistence, and the kind of military foresight that appears obvious only in hindsight. Johann Nicholas von Dreyse was not a soldier, but a gunsmith's apprentice from Sömmerda, Thuringia. Born in 1787, he learned his trade during the Napoleonic Wars, an era when the smoothbore musket reigned supreme and rate of fire mattered more than accuracy. A trained soldier could fire perhaps 3 rounds per minute with a muzzle-loading musket, a process requiring the soldier to stand upright, pour powder down the barrel, ram home a ball and wadding, prime the pan, cock the hammer, aim and fire. This choreography had remained essentially unchanged for 150 years. In 1809, working in the Paris workshop of Swiss gunsmith Jean-Samuel Pauli, young Dreyse encountered an idea that would obsess him for decades. Pauli was experimenting with breech-loading firearms, weapons that loaded from the rear of the barrel rather than the muzzle. The concept was ancient. Breech-loading guns had existed since the 1500s, but they suffered from fundamental problems. The breech seal leaked gas, the mechanisms were fragile, and most critically, there was no reliable way to ignite the powder charge. The flintlock ignition system required access to a pan at the side of the barrel, impossible with a closed breech. Pauli's innovation was to place the primer inside the cartridge itself, creating what we would recognize as a self-contained round. But his design used a complicated mechanical base that made each cartridge expensive and difficult to manufacture. Dreyse saw the potential and the problem. After returning to Prussia in 1814, he spent years developing a simpler solution. His breakthrough came in the 1820s when he invented a cartridge that placed the primer not at the base but inside the powder charge itself, ahead of the bullet. To ignite this primer, a long needle-like firing pin would pierce the paper cartridge case, pass through the powder charge, and strike the primer disc positioned behind the bullet. It was elegantly simple and mechanically complex. The needle had to be long enough to reach through the entire cartridge, but strong enough to reliably strike the primer. The bolt mechanism had to seal the breech adequately while remaining simple enough for field soldiers to operate under combat stress. Dreyse spent years refining the design. By 1836, he had a working prototype that impressed the Prussian military enough to order extensive testing. The conservative Prussian General Staff, scarred by the memory of defeat at Jena in 1806, and rebuilt by reformers like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, approached new technology with cautious interest rather than reflexive rejection. The testing process was exhaustive. Over 60,000 rounds fired through multiple prototypes, field trials in all weather conditions, durability tests that pushed the mechanisms to failure. The results were mixed. The rifle worked magnificently when properly maintained, but the needle did break, usually after 800 to 1,000 rounds. The paper cartridges were moisture sensitive. The gas seal leaked enough to cause minor burns if soldiers held their faces too close. But the advantages were overwhelming. A trained soldier could fire 10 to 12 aimed rounds per minute, 4 times faster than any muzzle loader. More importantly, the soldier could load and fire from a prone position, from behind cover, even while retreating. The tactical implications were revolutionary. For centuries, infantry tactics had been constrained by the muzzle-loading musket. Soldiers had to stand to load, which meant they had to fight in tight formations that could maintain discipline under fire. The lethal range of smoothbore muskets was about 100 yards, which meant battles devolved into close-range volleys followed by bayonet charges, the side, that could maintain formation discipline and deliver synchronized volleys typically won. The needle gun shattered these constraints. Prussian infantry could take cover, spread out, and maintain fire rates that made traditional formations suicidal. They could advance while firing, something previously impossible. Most revolutionary of all, they could fight effectively as skirmishers, dispersed across the battlefield rather than massed in vulnerable columns. In 1841, after 5 years of testing, Prussia made a decision that would reshape European military history. King Friedrich Wilhelm IV authorized production of the Dreyse Needle Gun for the entire Prussian infantry. It was a staggering commitment. Over 300,000 rifles would need to be manufactured. Soldiers would need retraining in completely new tactics. The logistics of supplying paper cartridges instead of powder, ball and caps would require reorganizing the entire military supply system. Most dangerously, if the weapon failed in combat, Prussia would be defenseless, its infantry armed with rifles that didn't work and untrained in the traditional methods their enemies still used. The decision showed remarkable institutional courage. In an era when military procurement moved at glacial pace and conventional wisdom held that breech loaders were unreliable, Prussia bet its security on an unproven technology. The bet paid off, but not immediately. The first combat test came in 1848 during the German revolutions. Prussian troops armed with needle guns suppressed uprisings in Baden and Saxony, but the fighting was against poorly armed civilians and militia. The weapons' advantages were obvious, but the opponents too weak to provide meaningful validation. The real test came in 1849 when Prussia mobilized against Denmark over control of Schleswig and Holstein. Danish forces armed with modern muzzle-loading rifles expected a conventional fight. What they encountered at the skirmish of Rinkenäs on April 6th was something entirely different. 3 Prussian companies, about 360 men, engaged a Danish force of over 1,000 soldiers occupying a fortified village. Traditional tactics would have required the Prussians to form up, advance in column, deploy into line under fire, and assault with the bayonet. Instead, the Prussian company commanders ordered their men to disperse and advance by rushes, with sections providing covering fire while others moved forward. The Danish defenders, firing from windows and behind barricades, initially held their ground. Their Austrian-made muzzle-loading rifles were accurate and well-made, but they could only fire perhaps 3 aimed shots per minute and had to expose themselves to reload. The Prussian soldiers, lying prone behind any available cover, poured in 5 to 6 rounds per minute. The Danish position was suppressed, unable to return effective fire against enemies who never presented massed targets. Within 40 minutes, the Prussians had worked their way close, enough to assault with the bayonet. The Danes, demoralized by the sustained fire and unable to see how few attackers they actually faced, retreated in disorder. Prussian casualties were 11 wounded. Danish losses exceeded 120 killed and wounded plus 60 captured. The after-action report sent to Copenhagen described the Prussian rifles' performance in almost awed terms. One Danish officer wrote that the enemy appeared to fire continuously without pausing to reload, that individual Prussian soldiers seemed to be worth 3 or 4 Danish troops in firepower. But Denmark was a small power, and the war ended quickly through diplomatic settlement. The European military establishment took note but remained unconvinced. The Austrian, French and British armies continued to arm their infantry with percussion-cap muzzle-loaders, weapons that were tried, tested and thoroughly understood. Prussia's needle gun was dismissed as a niche advantage suitable for a second-rate power with more money than sense. This dismissive attitude persisted through the 1850s and early 1860s. Military theorists acknowledged the needle gun's rate of fire but argued that this encouraged undisciplined shooting and wasted ammunition. They pointed out correctly that the needle did break and required replacement. They noted accurately that the gas seal leaked and that paper cartridges were less weatherproof than separate powder and ball. Most importantly, they argued that traditional infantry tactics based on disciplined volleys and bayonet charges had won every major European war for 200 years. Why change a system that worked? The Prussian General Staff, under the leadership of Helmuth von Moltke, had a different answer. The needle gun didn't just shoot faster, it enabled entirely new tactical concepts. Moltke, appointed Chief of the General Staff in 1857, was a military intellectual who understood that technology and tactics evolved together. He restructured Prussian infantry doctrine around the needle gun's capabilities. Prussian infantry would fight dispersed in extended lines, not massed columns. They would use terrain for cover rather than relying on formation discipline to absorb casualties. They would advance by rushes with supporting fire, not in lockstep parade ground precision. Most revolutionary of all, Prussian infantry would be expected to use initiative and adapt to battlefield conditions rather than simply following orders. This required a complete transformation of training and military culture. Prussian soldiers spent months practicing aimed fire at individual targets, learning to judge distances and adjust their sights. They trained to advance while firing, to transition smoothly from marching column to skirmish line, to coordinate fire and movement at the company and platoon level. Officers and NCOs were taught to lead dispersed formations and to expect their men to fight intelligently, even when isolated from higher command. The Austrian army, Prussia's most likely opponent, took the opposite approach. Austrian infantry doctrine emphasized the shock of the bayonet charge supported by massed artillery. Austrian soldiers trained to advance in dense columns that could quickly deploy into line, deliver one or two devastating volleys at close range, and then charge with the bayonet. It was the culmination of 50 years of tactical refinement, incorporating lessons from the Napoleonic Wars and the Italian campaigns of 1848 and 1859. Austrian infantry carried the Lorenz rifle, an excellent muzzle-loading percussion cap weapon, considered one of the finest military rifles in the world. At 300,000 units produced, it had even been imported by both sides during the American Civil War. Accurate to 500 yards, reliable and well-made, the Lorenz represented the peak of muzzle-loading technology. Austrian soldiers trained constantly in volley fire, achieving rates of 3 aimed shots per minute that matched the best infantry in Europe. When diplomatic tensions between Prussia and Austria escalated in 1866 over control of the German states, both sides prepared for what they expected to be a decisive traditional war. Austria mobilized its Italian front army and shifted forces north to Bohemia. Prussia mobilized 3 armies totaling 280,000 men and prepared to invade Austrian territory. European military observers expected a long campaign, with set-piece battles decided by superior generalship and troop quality. The Austrians were favoured. Their army had more combat experience, having fought major campaigns in Italy against France and Sardinia as recently as 1859. Their artillery was superior, 800 guns versus Prussia's 600. Their cavalry was considered the finest in Europe. Most European military professionals expected Austria to win, probably within 2 to 3 months of hard fighting. The campaign opened on June 23, 1866, when 3 Prussian armies crossed into Bohemia from different directions. Moltke's operational plan was brilliant, using Prussia's superior railway network to concentrate divided forces at the decisive point. But the tactical encounters in the first weeks of the campaign revealed something the Austrians found deeply disturbing. At Podol on June 26th, a single Prussian battalion of 800 men held a village against repeated Austrian attacks by an entire brigade of over 4,000 soldiers. The Prussians, firing from windows and behind walls, poured such devastating fire into the attacking Austrian columns that 3 separate charges broke before reaching the Prussian positions. Austrian after-action reports described the Prussian fire as a continuous roar rather than the sharp volleys of traditional infantry combat. At Trautenau on June 27th, the Austrians won a tactical victory, forcing Prussian forces to retreat. But the casualty ratio was disturbing. The Prussians suffered 277 casualties while inflicting 5,700 on the Austrians, a kill ratio of more than 4 to 1 despite being outnumbered and eventually retreating. Austrian soldiers began to report that advancing against Prussian infantry was impossible, that the fire was too heavy, that men fell in waves before getting close enough to use their bayonets. By early July, both armies were concentrating near the fortified town of Königgrätz on the Elbe River. Benedek, commanding the Austrian army, chose his ground carefully. He positioned his forces along a series of low ridges with good fields of fire, his flanks anchored on villages that could be fortified. His plan was traditional and sound. Let the Prussians attack, shatter them with artillery and rifle volleys, then counterattack with infantry columns supported by cavalry. The Austrian position was strong, and their numbers were superior. 215,000 Austrians with 800 guns faced 221,000 Prussians with 600 guns. But the Prussian forces were divided, approaching from 3 directions and not yet concentrated. Benedek had an opportunity to defeat them in detail before they could unite. On the evening of July the 2nd, both armies knew a major battle would occur the next morning. Austrian soldiers prepared their positions, cleaned their rifles, and received final instructions. They were confident. They had the better ground, better artillery, and they outnumbered the immediately available Prussian forces. The Prussians they would face tomorrow were commanded by Prince Friedrich Karl, an adequate but not brilliant general. The Austrian officers studied their maps and made final dispositions. They anticipated a hard fight but expected victory. They had no idea they were about to experience military obsolescence. July 3rd, 1866, dawned with heavy fog blanketing the Bistritz River Valley. The first Prussian probes began at 7 a.m. as Prussian infantry from the Elbe army, Prince Friedrich Karl's force, advanced toward the Austrian positions around the village of Sadowa. The initial Austrian response was conventional. Artillery opened fire at the advancing Prussian columns, forcing them to deploy from march formation into attack lines. This was exactly what Austrian doctrine prescribed. Disrupt the enemy with artillery, force them to deploy under fire, then destroy them with coordinated infantry volleys and counterattack. But something was wrong. The Prussian infantry didn't deploy in the expected dense lines. Instead, they dispersed into loose skirmish formations that presented few targets for Austrian artillery. And they didn't stop to return fire in organised volleys. They kept advancing, individuals and small groups rushing forward while others fired, creating a continuous ripple of movement and shooting that Austrian officers had never encountered. Major Karl von Bernhardt, commanding the Austrian 8th Jäger Battalion defending near Sadowa, watched the Prussian advance with growing confusion. His battalion occupied good positions along a sunken road, with clear fields of fire extending 400 yards to the woodline where the Prussians were emerging. He had 800 men armed with Lorenz rifles, and he'd positioned them to deliver devastating volleys at any force attempting to cross that open ground. But the Prussians weren't crossing in formation. They were infiltrating forward in small groups, using every fold in the ground for cover, and the fire coming from those dispersed groups was incredibly heavy. Bernhardt ordered his men to commence volley fire at 300 yards. The 800 Lorenz rifles crashed in unison, a wall of lead sweeping across the field. Smoke obscured the target area. Through his telescope, Bernhardt saw several Prussians fall, but the rest had gone to ground behind a slight rise he'd barely noticed during his terrain reconnaissance. Before his men could reload, the Prussians returned fire, not a volley but a continuous rattling roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Individual Austrians began falling. The soldier next to Bernhardt jerked backward, a needle gun bullet through his chest. Another man screamed as a round shattered his shoulder. Bernhardt ordered a second volley. Again the Austrian rifles crashed. Again Prussian soldiers fell. But there were so many of them still firing. Bernhardt had been in combat against the Italians and Sardinians. He knew what sustained infantry combat sounded like. This was different. The Prussian fire never paused. It was as if they had twice as many rifles as they actually did. His men were loading as fast as they could, 3 rounds per minute. Good disciplined fire by any standard. But they were being outshot 5-1. Within 20 minutes, Bernhardt's battalion had suffered 120 casualties without the Prussians even reaching assault range. The men began to waver. Some cowered behind the sunken road rather than exposing themselves to reload. Others fired wildly without aiming, just trying to return fire. When Prussian infantry finally rushed the position, bayonets fixed, Bernhardt's battalion broke and retreated in disorder. 1,000 yards to the south, the same scenario was playing out at the village of Dohalis. Austrian infantry from the 3rd Corps had fortified the village buildings and prepared to defend it in traditional fashion. Let the enemy advance, deliver volleys at close range, counterattack with the bayonet. But the Prussian 7th Division approached differently. Instead of forming up for a frontal assault, Prussian companies dispersed around the village and began firing at individual windows and doorways. Austrian soldiers trying to aim and fire found themselves targeted by multiple Prussian rifles. A man would rise to shoot and be hit by 3 or 4 bullets almost simultaneously. The volume of incoming fire was so heavy that the Austrians couldn't maintain aimed fire. They would pop up, shoot in the general direction of the enemy and duck back down. The Prussians, lying prone or kneeling behind cover, could aim carefully and fire repeatedly. Within an hour, Dohalis was evacuated, the Austrian defenders falling back to secondary positions, having suffered 200 casualties without inflicting significant losses on the attackers. By 9 a.m, the Austrian centre was under severe pressure. Prussian infantry had seized several key villages and were advancing steadily despite being outnumbered. Austrian counterattacks, launched in traditional column formation, were shot to pieces before reaching the Prussian lines. At Problus, an entire Austrian battalion of 900 men charged across 200 yards of open ground toward a Prussian position held by perhaps 400 soldiers. The Austrian infantry advanced in perfect formation, drums beating, officers leading from the front. It was textbook 19th century warfare, the kind of charge that had broken enemy lines from Austerlitz to Solferino. The Prussian company commanders waited until the Austrians were 150 yards away, then gave the command to commence rapid fire. 400 needle guns opened up simultaneously, then kept firing. 5 shots per gun in the first minute, 2,000 bullets in 60 seconds. The Austrian formation staggered as if it had hit an invisible wall. The front rank seemed to melt away. The second rank stepped over the bodies and kept advancing. More men fell. The third rank wavered. By the time the Austrian survivors were 80 yards away, the formation had disintegrated. Men sought any cover, huddled behind dead horses and fallen comrades. The charge had broken without ever reaching the Prussian line. Of the 900 Austrians who had advanced, over 400 were dead or wounded. Prussian casualties were 11 wounded. Benedek, watching the battle develop from his command post at the windmill near Lippe, recognized that something fundamental had gone wrong. His infantry, the finest in Europe, was being systematically shredded. The Prussian advance wasn't dramatic or swift, but it was inexorable. Every position his men held eventually fell to that terrible sustained fire. Every counterattack failed before reaching the enemy. By 10:30 a.m, the Austrian centre was in danger of collapse. But Benedek had reserves, and he had a plan. The Prussian forces attacking him were the Elbe army under Prince Friedrich Karl, perhaps 90,000 men. Unknown to the Prussians, Benedek had identified their vulnerability. Friedrich Karl's army was isolated. The other 2 Prussian armies, the First Army under Prince Frederick Charles and the Second Army under Crown Prince Frederick William, were still marching toward the battlefield from different directions. If Benedek could crush Friedrich Karl's army before the other Prussian forces arrived, he could still win. He ordered a massive counterattack by his reserve corps. 25,000 fresh Austrian infantry would advance and drive the Prussians back across the Bistritz River. The Austrian 5th Corps began its advance at 11 a.m. It was a magnificent sight that would have been perfectly at home in the Napoleonic Wars. Brigade after brigade in perfect formation, white coats and dark trousers, flags flying, bands playing. The columns stretched for over a mile, 25,000 men advancing in parade ground precision across the rolling farmland toward the Prussian positions. From the Prussian side, the advancing Austrian masses appeared unstoppable. Company commanders watched through field glasses as the white tide flowed toward them. Some officers later admitted to feeling a moment of doubt. They were outnumbered locally, perhaps 8,000 Prussian infantry, immediately in the path of 25,000 attacking Austrians. If those columns closed to bayonet range, if they maintained formation discipline under fire, the Prussians would be overwhelmed by sheer mass. But the Prussians had been training for this exact scenario for 20 years. Every company commander knew the doctrine: assume firing positions, use terrain for cover, commence sustained rapid fire at maximum effective range. Don't wait for orders, don't fire volleys, just keep shooting. At 700 yards, scattered Prussian soldiers began firing, At 600 yards, entire companies opened up. The distinctive crack of needle guns firing rapidly began to build into a continuous roar. The Austrian columns kept advancing. Men began to fall, but the formations closed ranks and maintained their pace. This was what Austrian soldiers trained for, advancing under fire with parade ground discipline, but the fire kept intensifying. At 500 yards, the leading Austrian battalions were losing men steadily, perhaps 10 to 15 soldiers per minute across the entire formation. The columns began to compress as men instinctively crowded together for psychological comfort. This only made them better targets. At 400 yards, the Austrian formations began to waver. The fire was too heavy. Officers were falling at an appalling rate, easy targets in their distinctive uniforms mounted on horseback. Senior sergeants stepped up to command companies, then they fell too. The carefully choreographed advance began to lose coordination. Some battalions continued forward, others slowed. Gaps appeared in the formation. At 300 yards, the Austrian attack collapsed. Not all at once, but in pieces. A battalion would halt, men seeking whatever cover existed trying to return fire. Another battalion would push forward a few more yards, then stop. Officers screamed orders, threatened, cajoled. Some men responded, took a few steps forward and went to ground again. Others simply huddled behind dead horses, fallen comrades, anything that might stop a bullet. The Prussian fire never slackened. 400 rounds per gun, enough ammunition for 80 seconds of continuous fire at 5 shots per minute. Soldiers fired until their barrels were hot enough to burn skin on contact, then kept firing. When guns jammed or needles broke, soldiers grabbed rifles from wounded comrades and kept shooting. By 11:30 a.m., the Austrian 4-Corps counterattack had stalled 200 yards from the Prussian positions. Over 3,000 Austrians were casualties. The survivors were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat, taking steady casualties from Prussian soldiers they couldn't effectively engage. And then things got worse for Austria. At noon, the first units of the Prussian Second Army under Crown Prince Frederick William arrived on the Austrian right flank. These were fresh troops, 100,000 men with full ammunition loads and no combat fatigue. Worse still, they arrived on the high ground overlooking the Austrian positions. Benedek's carefully chosen defensive position was now a trap. Austrian units along the threatened flank tried to redeploy to face this new threat. Moving in the open under fire from 2 directions proved catastrophic. Entire battalions dissolved under the weight of fire. Wounded men were shot again as they tried to crawl to safety. Units that maintained formation and tried to march to new positions were targeted by every Prussian rifle within range. The Austrian cavalry tried to intervene. The famous Austrian cuirassiers, heavy cavalry in white uniforms and steel breastplates, launched several charges trying to disrupt the Prussian formations. These mounted attacks, so effective against infantry in squares, found no such targets. Prussian infantry didn't form squares. They maintained their dispersed lines and simply shot the horsemen as they approached. At Stresitz, a squadron of Austrian cuirassiers charged a Prussian battalion in the open. 150 horsemen at full gallop, sabres drawn, the ground shaking from the hoofbeats. The Prussian soldiers knelt in a loose line and opened fire at 400 yards. Horses and men tumbled. The charge continued, closing to 300 yards, then 200. The Prussian fire was continuous, multiple shots striking each horse and rider. At 150 yards, the charge faltered. Too many horses down, too many gaps in the formation. The surviving cavalrymen wheeled away, having never reached striking distance. Of 150 men who charged, fewer than 40 returned unwounded. By 1 p.m., the Austrian army was in full retreat. What had been an organised defensive position was now a mob of defeated soldiers streaming east toward the Elbe. Benedek tried to organise rearguard actions, but units were too disorganised and demoralised. Prussian infantry advanced steadily, maintaining fire on the retreating columns. Austrian artillery, which had performed well all day, couldn't effectively cover the retreat because their own infantry was in the line of fire. The retreat became a rout. Soldiers abandoned their rifles to move faster. Entire companies surrendered rather than face more of that terrible fire. Supply wagons were abandoned, wounded were left behind. Discipline, the foundation of 19th century military effectiveness, collapsed completely. The Prussian cavalry pursued, but with limited success. The Austrian cavalry covered the retreat effectively, and the broken terrain of Bohemia favoured the defenders. but Prussian infantry continued to push forward, firing at any formed Austrian units they encountered. By evening, the Austrian army had escaped, across the Elbe, leaving behind 44,000 casualties. The Prussians had suffered 9,000 casualties, a kill ratio of nearly 5-1. More significantly, the Austrians lost 20,000 prisoners and 174 guns. The Austrian army's fighting capability was destroyed. Individual soldiers were largely intact, but the units had lost cohesion, officers were dead or missing, supply wagons were abandoned. It would take weeks to reorganize the army into an effective fighting force. The Prussians had those weeks. Within 3 weeks, the war was over. Austria agreed to Prussian terms that expelled Austria from German affairs and set the stage for Prussian unification of Germany. The Battle of Königgrätz was decisive not just because Prussia won, but because of how they won. The needle gun had made traditional infantry tactics obsolete overnight. The carefully refined doctrines that had dominated European warfare for 200 years had been proven worthless against breech-loading rifles used by properly trained infantry. The international military community reacted with shock. Observers from Britain, France, Russia and other powers had watched the battle, and their reports created panic in military ministries across Europe. France immediately accelerated development of the Chassepot breech-loading rifle and had equipped its entire infantry by 1868. Britain scrambled to adopt the Snyder breech-loading conversion of existing rifles. Russia began developing the Berdan rifle. Austria itself adopted the Wunzel breech-loading conversion, then the superior Wurndl rifle. Within 5 years, every major European army had adopted breech-loading rifles. The muzzle-loader, dominant for 400 years, disappeared from frontline service in less than a decade. But the tactical lessons were harder to absorb. The Prussian success wasn't just about the weapon. It was about doctrine, training, and military culture. The Prussians had spent 20 years developing tactics suited to breech-loading rifles. They trained soldiers to use initiative rather than simply follow orders. They expected officers to adapt to battlefield conditions rather than execute predetermined plans. The Austrian army and most other European forces tried to adopt breech-loading rifles without changing their tactical doctrines. They issued new weapons but trained soldiers to use them in the same massed formations and volley fire tactics that had failed so catastrophically at Königgrätz. This partially successful adaptation would lead to the horrific casualties of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and ultimately to the trench warfare of World War I. The Dreyse Needle Gun itself had a relatively short service life. By 1870, it was already being replaced by more modern breech loaders with metal cartridges that eliminated the gas seal problems and fragile needles. The French Chassepot, adopted in 1866, was superior in almost every way. Better range, better accuracy, better reliability. Yet the Chassepot-armed French infantry was crushed by the Prussians in 1870 using essentially the same tactics perfected at Königgrätz. Technology mattered, but training and doctrine mattered more. The psychological impact of Königgrätz on the Austrian military was profound and lasting. For decades afterward, Austrian veterans spoke of the Prussian fire with something approaching trauma. The continuous roar, the inability to return effective fire, the helplessness of watching formations melt away without ever reaching the enemy. A generation of Austrian officers grew up believing their army was inherently inferior to the Prussians, a defeatism that would hobble Austrian military effectiveness into World War I. The needle gun's designer, Johann Nikolaus von Dreyse, didn't live to see the full impact of his invention. He died in 1867 at age 80, just 1 year after Königgrätz, but he knew his weapon had changed warfare forever. In his final correspondence with the Prussian War Ministry, he reflected on the battle's lessons. The needle gun's value is not primarily in its rate of fire, though that is considerable. Its value is in what it allows the soldier to do. He can take cover, he can move while fighting, he can think and adapt. The weapon transforms infantry from a tool that generals manipulate into intelligent fighters who can win battles on their own initiative. This, not the mechanical advantages, is why we prevailed. At the Heeresgeschichtliches Museum in Vienna, the Austrian Military History Museum, there's a display case containing a Lawrence rifle and a captured Prussian needle gun side by side. The placard describes the technical specifications of each weapon. Visitors can see that the Lorentz was actually superior in some ways. Better range, more resistant to weather, simpler maintenance. But none of that mattered on July 3, 1866. The case also contains a remarkable artifact, a diary entry from an Austrian infantry officer who survived the battle. "We fought bravely. We advanced in good order. We followed our training and our doctrine, and we were destroyed, not by better soldiers, not by superior tactics, but by men with rifles that shot faster than ours. In the future, wars will be won by factories and engineers as much as by soldiers. We learned this truth in blood on the fields of Königgrätz." The Dreyse Needle Gun represented the first time in modern warfare that a technological advantage was decisive enough to overcome superior numbers, better position, and equal courage. The Austrian soldiers at Königgrätz were not cowards. They were not poorly trained. They were not badly led. They simply carried weapons that fired 3 rounds per minute against an enemy who fired 5 rounds per minute, and that difference was unsurvivable. The battle marked the transition from warfare dominated by morale and discipline to warfare dominated by firepower and technology. The lessons would be forgotten and relearned at horrific cost over the next 50 years. But on July 3rd, 1866, in the hills of Bohemia, the modern age of warfare was born. The Dreyse Needle Gun had spoken, and 44,000 Austrians had fallen to the message it delivered. The age of the muzzle loader was over. The age of industrial warfare had begun. The Austrian military's institutional response to Königgrätz revealed how deeply the defeat had shaken their confidence. In the weeks following the battle, as diplomats negotiated the peace terms that would reshape Central Europe, Austrian military investigators fanned out across Bohemia, interviewing survivors, examining abandoned positions, and trying to understand exactly what had gone wrong. The reports they compiled make for sobering reading even 150 years later. Colonel Franz Kuhn von Kuhnenfeld, tasked with analysing the IV Corps' failed counterattack, spent 3 days walking the battlefield with a team of engineers and medical officers. They mapped where bodies had fallen, measured distances from Prussian positions, and calculated fields of fire. Kuhn's report, submitted in August 1866, contained a statistical analysis that horrified the Austrian High Command. The IV Corps had advanced across approximately 800 yards of open ground. Austrian casualties began at 600 yards and increased exponentially as range decreased. At 600 yards, casualties were roughly 2% per minute of exposure. At 400 yards, this increased to 8% per minute. At 300 yards, where the attack stalled, formations were suffering 15% casualties per minute. Kuhn calculated that an Austrian battalion attempting to cross 400 yards of open ground under Prussian needle gun fire would suffer 50% casualties before closing to bayonet range, and this assumed the unit maintained perfect discipline and maximum speed throughout. More disturbing was Kuhn's analysis of ammunition expenditure. Prussian positions overrun late in the battle yielded mountains of spent cartridge cases. Kuhn's team collected and counted over 400,000 empty paper cartridges from Prussian positions. By comparing this to estimated Prussian troop strength in those sectors, they calculated that the average Prussian soldier had fired between 40 and 60 rounds during the battle. Austrian soldiers, by comparison, averaged 15 to 20 rounds fired. The Prussians had delivered roughly 3 times as much lead downrange despite being outnumbered through much of the battle. Kuhn's conclusion was bleak. Against needle gun-equipped infantry employing dispersed tactics and rapid fire, traditional assault columns are obsolete. The mathematics of destruction are insurmountable. We cannot close to bayonet range before formations collapse. We cannot return effective fire from column formation. We cannot match their rate of fire even when deployed in line. Either we adopt similar weapons and tactics, or we must accept that our infantry is obsolete. But Austria's problems went deeper than just weapons. The Prussian tactical system that had proven so effective at Königgrätz required a different type of soldier than Austrian doctrine produced. Prussian infantry training emphasized individual initiative, marksmanship, and small unit tactics. Soldiers were expected to think, to adapt, to take cover and advance without constant direction from officers. Austrian training, by contrast, emphasized obedience, formation discipline, and synchronized movements. Austrian soldiers were trained to be components of a formation, not independent fighters. This difference reflected deeper social and political divisions. Prussia had a relatively literate population, with widespread elementary education, and a tradition of minor nobility serving as military officers who knew their men personally. Austria was a polyglot empire where many soldiers couldn't speak German, where officers were often aristocrats with no connection to their men, where illiteracy rates in some units exceeded 50%. The kind of dispersed, initiative-driven tactics that worked for Prussians would require fundamental social changes in Austria, not just new rifles. The Prussian General Staff understood this perfectly. In the official history of the 1866 campaign, published in 1869, Moltke's staff emphasised that the needle gun's value lay not in its mechanical superiority, but in how it enabled a different kind of warfare. The breech-loading rifle allows the soldier to be a hunter rather than a musketeer. He need not stand in formation to load. He need not wait for orders to fire. He can use terrain, can move while fighting, can adapt to circumstances. This requires not just a different weapon, but a different soldier, one who has been educated to think as well as obey. This insight was largely lost on other European militaries rushing to adopt breech-loading rifles in the wake of Königgrätz. The French chassepot rifle, adopted in 1866 and issued army-wide by 1868, was mechanically superior to the Dreyse in every way. It used a rubber obturator that sealed the breech perfectly, eliminating gas leakage. It had longer range, better accuracy, and more robust construction. French military planners congratulated themselves on having learned the lessons of Königgrätz and improved upon them. But French infantry tactics remained fundamentally unchanged. French soldiers still trained to fight in dense formations, still emphasised volley fire over individual marksmanship, still expected to win battles through synchronised movements and bayonet charges. The French had adopted Prussian weapons without adopting Prussian thinking. This would prove catastrophic in 1870. The story of how the needle gun's lessons were mislearned by France is a case study in institutional blindness. French military observers had been present at Königgrätz. Their reports clearly describe Prussian tactics and the effectiveness of dispersed formations with rapid individual fire. But the French General Staff filtered these observations through existing prejudices about French military superiority and the importance of élan, aggressive spirit in warfare. Marshal Adolphe Niel, French Minister of War from 1867 to 1869, pushed for military reforms that included adopting the chassepot and reorganising the army. But when he proposed reforming tactics to emphasise dispersed formations and individual initiative, he encountered fierce resistance. French military theorists argued that French soldiers possessed superior élan that would overcome any tactical disadvantage. They claimed that dense formations were necessary to maintain control over soldiers who might otherwise lose their offensive spirit. Most fundamentally, they couldn't imagine abandoning tactical doctrines that had won glory for France from Napoleon to the Crimea. The result was a hybrid system that combined breech-loading rifles with traditional tactics, the worst of both worlds. French infantry in 1870 would advance in dense formations that presented perfect targets for Prussian needle guns, while their own superior chassepot rifles were used in ways that negated their advantages. The French would fire volleys from standing positions, while Prussians fired rapidly from cover. French soldiers would advance in step while Prussians rushed forward in loose groups. Technology alone couldn't overcome doctrine and training. The needle gun itself was already obsolescent by 1870. The Prussian army had begun replacing it with the Mauser Model 1871, a rifle using metal cartridges that eliminated the paper cartridge's weaknesses and the troublesome needle mechanism. But the Prussians retained the tactical doctrines developed around the needle gun, and these doctrines remained devastatingly effective. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 proved that Königgrätz was not a fluke. At Wissembourg, Wörth, Spicheren, and a dozen other battles, Prussian infantry using the same tactics perfected in 1866 destroyed French armies despite the French having technically superior rifles. The pattern was depressingly familiar. French infantry would advance in formation, Prussian infantry would disperse and maintain rapid fire, French attacks would stall under the weight of fire, Prussian counterattacks would roll over disorganised French formations. At the Battle of Gravelotte on August 18, 1870, French infantry armed with chassepot rifles defending strong positions should have massacred attacking Prussian formations. The chassepot outranged the Prussian rifles by 300 yards and was more accurate at all distances. But the French fought from standing positions, delivering disciplined volleys, while Prussian attackers went to ground and maintained rapid individual fire. After 9 hours of combat, the Prussians had broken the French position, despite suffering horrendous casualties. French commanders afterward complained that their soldiers couldn't see the Prussian infantry to shoot at them, that the enemy seemed to fire from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The needle gun's ultimate legacy was not the weapon itself, but the tactical revolution it enabled. By 1871, every major European army had adopted breech-loading rifles with metal cartridges. The Dreyse's peculiar needle mechanism was already a historical curiosity, but the tactical lessons, the understanding that modern firepower required dispersion, individual initiative and fire and movement tactics, these took far longer to sink in. The British Army, observing both Königgrätz and the Franco-Prussian War, adopted breech-loading rifles but retained close-order tactics through the 1870s and 1880s. British colonial campaigns against poorly armed opponents reinforced beliefs that courage and discipline could overcome firepower. Only after suffering shocking casualties in the Second Boer War in 1899 to 1902, when Boer marksmen using modern rifles from dispersed positions devastated British formations, did the British fully embrace open-order tactics. The Russians adopted the Berdan rifle in 1868, but their tactical doctrines remained fixated on mass and shock. Russian military theorists argued that the vast conscript armies Russia could mobilize would simply overwhelm any enemy through weight of numbers. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 demonstrated the fallacy of this thinking when Japanese infantry using magazine rifles and modern tactics destroyed Russian armies attacking in dense formations. The battles of Mukden and Liaoyang saw casualty ratios reminiscent of Königgrätz, with attacking Russians suffering catastrophic losses to entrenched Japanese defenders. Each of these later conflicts validated the lessons Königgrätz should have taught. Firepower dominates tactics. Infantry in dense formations are helpless against entrenched defenders with modern rifles. Attacks across open ground require suppressing fire, careful use of terrain, and dispersed formations. Yet each generation of military leaders seemed determined to learn these lessons anew through the blood of their soldiers. The needle gun also revealed a disturbing trend in modern warfare that would reach its apotheosis in World War I, the growing disconnect between technological capability and tactical doctrine. Weapons evolved rapidly in the late 19th century, from muzzle loaders to breech loaders to magazine rifles to machine guns. But tactical thinking evolved far more slowly, constrained by institutional conservatism, romantic notions of warfare, and the difficulty of training large conscript armies in complex tactics. The result was an ever-widening gap between what weapons could do and how they were used. At Königgrätz, this gap favoured Prussia because they had closed it through intensive training and doctrinal innovation. But by 1914, the gap had opened again. Every European army had machine guns, quick-firing artillery and magazine rifles, but most still trained their infantry to attack in dense formations, still emphasized offensive spirit over tactical sophistication, still believed that courage could overcome firepower. The Western Front's trench warfare was the logical endpoint of firepower without tactical adaptation. Armies with weapons capable of defending any position indefinitely attempted to attack using tactics, only marginally evolved from those that failed at Königgrätz. The result was 4 years of slaughter that cost millions of lives and ultimately required tanks, aircraft, and revolutionary tactical doctrines to break the stalemate. Some military theorists in the 1870s and 1880s understood where things were heading. Colonel Charles Ardent Dupic, a French military thinker who died in 1870 at the Battle of Metz, wrote extensively about how modern firepower was changing warfare. His posthumously published work, Battle Studies, analysed how increasing firepower affected soldier morale and unit cohesion. Dupic argued that future battles would be won not by courage alone, but by sophisticated tactics that accounted for human psychology under modern firepower. 4 brave men who do not know each other will not dare to attack a lion. 4 less brave, but knowing each other well, sure of their reliability and consequently of mutual aid, will attack resolutely. There is the science of the organisation of armies in a nutshell. Dupic understood that modern firepower required new forms of unit cohesion and tactical organisation. Soldiers needed to trust their comrades and leaders enough to advance under fire that any rational individual would avoid. This required intensive training, strong small unit leadership, and tactical doctrines that gave soldiers concrete tasks rather than just ordering them forward. The Prussian system after Königgrätz embodied these principles. Prussian infantry sections trained together for months, developing the mutual trust necessary to advance under fire Section leaders were carefully selected NCOs who understood tactics and could make decisions without officer supervision. Soldiers knew exactly what to do in various situations because they'd practiced endlessly. Attack a defended position. Some soldiers provide covering fire while others rush forward in short bounds. Take fire from an unexpected direction. Go to ground, identify the threat, and return fire while leaders assess and adapt. This level of tactical sophistication was expensive in time and resources. It required literate soldiers who could understand complex instructions. It demanded NCOs and junior officers capable of independent decision-making. It assumed a level of unit cohesion that took months to develop. Most European armies decided this was too difficult and expensive. Better to have more soldiers with simpler training, they reasoned. Better to emphasize obedience and courage than tactical sophistication. The needle gun's lessons about the importance of initiative and adaptation were quietly forgotten in favor of simpler doctrines that proved far less effective but were easier to implement. The technological evolution of rifles after the Dreyse moved quickly. The Mauser model 1871 replaced the needle gun with a more reliable design using metal cartridges. The Mauser 1871-84 added a tubular magazine holding 8 rounds. The French Lebel rifle of 1886 introduced smokeless powder, revolutionizing ballistics. The Mauser model 1898 established the controlled feed bolt action that became the template for military rifles worldwide. By 1900, a mere 34 years after Königgrätz, infantry rifles had evolved from single-shot breech-loaders to magazine-fed bolt actions firing smokeless cartridges with effective ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. But tactical doctrine lagged far behind. The French army in 1914 attacked in formations not drastically different from those used in 1866. British infantry in 1914 advanced in lines that would have been familiar to soldiers at Waterloo. Russian human wave attacks in 1914 and 1915 replicated the failed Austrian tactics at Königgrätz. The gap between technological capability and tactical adaptation had become a chasm. The machine gun, adopted by most armies in the 1890s and 1900s, was essentially a mechanized needle gun, delivering sustained rapid fire that made defensive positions nearly impregnable. Yet military planners consistently underestimated machine gun effectiveness. The British initially issued just 2 machine guns per battalion, considering them useful for defensive situations but not decisive weapons. The Germans were only marginally better, with 6 per battalion by 1914. Nobody seemed to grasp that a single well-positioned machine gun could stop a battalion-strength attack, that the lessons of Königgrätz about the dominance of rapid fire were about to be demonstrated on an industrial scale. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 was Königgrätz multiplied by 1,000. British infantry advancing in lines across open ground toward German positions equipped with machine guns suffered casualties that dwarfed anything seen in 1866. On the first day alone, July 1st, 1916, British forces suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. Many battalions lost 90% of their attacking strength before reaching German trenches. The pattern was identical to Königgrätz. Infantry in relatively dense formations attempting to cross open ground against defenders with superior firepower. The results were predictable and horrific. What made the Somme even more tragic was that the lessons were available to learn. Königgrätz was part of military history curricula at every staff college. The tactical problems were well understood. Yet institutional inertia, romantic attachment to offensive warfare, and the sheer difficulty of training millions of conscripts in sophisticated tactics meant that generals in 1916 essentially replicated the mistakes of Austrian commanders in 1866. The needle gun's inventor, Johann Nicolaus von Dreyse, could never have imagined how his weapon would reshape warfare. He designed a practical tool to solve a specific problem, how to increase infantry firepower. But the second and third order effects of that innovation transformed military organization, tactical doctrine, training methods, and ultimately the character of warfare itself. The needle gun made possible the kind of industrial warfare that would define the 20th century, warfare where production capacity and technological sophistication mattered as much as courage or leadership. In some ways, Dreyse would have been horrified by what his invention enabled. He was a craftsman who took pride in precision and quality. The mass production methods that churned out millions of rifles in the 20th century would have seemed alien to him. The casualty figures from later wars made possible in part by weapons evolved from his design, would have been incomprehensible. War in Dreyse's era was still fought by relatively small professional armies. The concept of millions of conscripts slaughtering each other in industrial-scale warfare was beyond 19th century imagination. Yet the path from the needle gun to the trenches of World War I was direct and logical. Once one nation adopted breech-loading rifles and demonstrated their effectiveness, every nation had to follow suit or accept military obsolescence. Once rifles could fire multiple rounds per minute from any position, defensive firepower became overwhelming. Once defensive firepower was overwhelming, attacks required either technological advantages like tanks and aircraft, or tactical sophistication that took years to develop, or acceptance of catastrophic casualties. The European powers in 1914 had none of the first two, and were willing to accept the third. The result was 4 years of slaughter. The Dreyse Needle Gun's place in military history is secure, as the first breech-loading rifle to be adopted as the standard weapon of a major army. But its deeper significance lies in what it revealed about the relationship between technology and tactics, between weapons and warfare, between innovation and institutions. Königgrätz should have taught European militaries that firepower had fundamentally changed warfare, that courage and discipline were no longer sufficient, that victory required tactical adaptation to technological reality. Instead, most military establishments learned narrower lessons about specific weapons while ignoring the deeper implications. This pattern would repeat throughout the 20th century. Tanks appeared in World War I, but their full potential wasn't realized until the Germans developed blitzkrieg tactics in the 1930s. Aircraft were used in World War I, but strategic bombing and air superiority doctrines took decades to mature. Nuclear weapons appeared in 1945, but nuclear strategy and deterrence theory evolved over decades of Cold War theorizing. Each major weapons innovation required not just the technology, but also the tactical and strategic thinking to employ it effectively. The needle gun was perhaps the first clear example of this pattern in the industrial age. Today, the few surviving Dreyse needle guns rest in museums, mechanical curiosities from a vanished era. They look primitive compared to modern rifles, with their ungainly bolts and paper cartridges. Visitors peer at them through glass, reading placards about their technical specifications, rarely grasping how revolutionary they were. But for a few crucial years in the 1860s, the needle gun was the most advanced infantry weapon in the world, and it changed everything. At the battlefield of Königgrätz, now known as Hradec Králové, there are monuments and museums commemorating the battle. The landscape has changed, forests have grown where there were open fields, villages have expanded, but the terrain still reveals the battle's geography. Walking from the Austrian positions toward where the Prussian line stood, you can visualize what those Austrian soldiers faced. 400 yards of open ground swept by rapid rifle fire, an impossible gulf between them and the enemy they were ordered to attack with bayonets. There's a particular monument on the battlefield, erected by Austria in 1869 to honour their dead, that captures the tragedy better than any tactical analysis. It shows an Austrian soldier mortally wounded reaching skyward. The inscription reads simply, "For Emperor and Fatherland." 44,000 Austrians fell at Königgrätz, and they fell not through cowardice or incompetence, but because they carried 3-shot-per-minute rifles against an enemy with 5-shot-per-minute rifles. That difference, just 2 additional rounds per minute, was insurmountable. The Dreyse needle gun proved that industrial technology could make traditional military virtues obsolete. Courage, discipline, and training remained important, but they could not overcome a fundamental technological disadvantage. An Austrian soldier at Königgrätz was as brave as any Prussian, but his bravery couldn't change the fact that his rifle reloaded slower. This was a new and disturbing reality for 19th century military establishments built on the belief that moral factors, courage, élan, discipline, mattered more than material ones. The lesson, uncomfortable then and now, is that wars between industrial powers are won as much in factories and engineering schools as on battlefields. The nation that can produce better weapons in greater quantities and train soldiers to use them effectively will prevail regardless of traditional military virtues. Prussia in 1866 didn't win because Prussian soldiers were braver than Austrians. They won because Prussia had invested in weapons development and tactical innovation, then built the training systems to exploit their advantages. Austria had relied on traditional methods and paid the price. This remains relevant in modern warfare. The most advanced technology is worthless without the doctrine, training, and institutional flexibility to employ it effectively. But given equal tactical sophistication, the side with technological advantages will usually prevail. The Dreyse Needle Gun, a simple mechanical device that lets soldiers load from the breech instead of the muzzle, demonstrated this fundamental truth. On July 3, 1866, in the hills of Bohemia, the modern world learned that industrial technology had changed warfare forever. The age of romantic military glory was ending. The age of industrial slaughter had begun. And 44,000 Austrian casualties at Königgrätz paid the tuition for that bitter lesson.